Firstly, I'd like to thank National Monuments and Archaeology Ireland for inviting me today to giving me the opportunity to present this fascinating site. Archaeology Plan carried out an excavation for a new school in the townland of Clonard of Folkestown Great in the winter of 2016. The conditions were pretty grim at times, so apologies for some of the photos. I hope the results of the excavation made up for it. The excavation uncovered an intriguing prehistoric landscape, informed and influenced by the wetlands located on the site, and by a very early pathway that survived as a route through this landscape for millennia. The site was located 1.7 kilometres inland from the coast at Balbriggan. A stream, known as the Braymore River, formed the southern side of the site and flows towards the sea to the north of Balbriggan. A hill rises to the northwest of Flemingtown and Balscadan, with two small hills on the opposite side of the valley in Cloghedar. The ground on either side of the stream has been wetland for a considerable length of time. A rise in the middle of the site further impacted drainage, and another swathe of marshy ground ran across the northern end at the break of slope at the base of the valley. This survived as a band of organic rich material, representing a series of small watercourses and pools. A pollen core was taken from the largest of the pools, with the earliest sedimentation dating to around 3600 BC. The pool was largely filled in by the end of the Neolithic, around 2500 BC. Numerous post-medieval drains cut through the material, indicating that drainage was still an issue until relatively recent times. Analysis of the core by Ellen O'Carroll suggested that the wider landscape was already opened by the earliest surviving levels, with low levels of closed canopy cover. This indicates that the woodland clearance carried out by early Neolithic population in the area, which may well have contributed to the deterioration of the wetlands within the site. The earliest and most intriguing feature on the site was the remains of a pathway, defined by two gullies which ran for 90 metres to the west. The gullies were around the same size and were 4 to 4.5 metres apart, measuring up to 60 centimetres in width and 45 centimetres in depth. They defined a path or a track that ran downhill towards the wetlands at the base of the small valley. At the break of slope in the hillside, the gullies separated slightly, enclosing a broader space. A gap in the eastern gully at this point provided access to attractive ground leading into the wetlands. Beyond this broader section, the path turned south, possibly to run along the higher ground to the north of the stream, or to an appropriate fording point. The gullies were filled with numerous thin lenses of sand and silt. The fills were largely sterile, with very rare charcoal noted. Samples were taken at 3 locations, and 2 of these were of sufficient quality to date. Both samples were ash and were from the western gully, one from the northern end and the second from the central section, with the sample location separated by over 50 metres. The northern sample returned a date of around 5620 to 5490 BC, while the central sample returned a date of 5670 to 5540 BC. The similarity of the two dates from 2 separate locations strongly suggests that the feature dates to the Mesolithic period and that the charcoal is not residual. While the gullies may have provided some drainage, this does not seem to have been their main function, as the gap in the eastern gully at the base of the slope would have been a poor drainage solution. The primary purpose of these gullies appears to have been to mark the route of the track. The interpretation of the feature as a path or track is based on a number of factors. Firstly, the long and linear nature of the two gullies. The gullies run approximately parallel for much of their length. Secondly, no cut features were identified in the space between the two gullies, which suggests that this space was used for a specific purpose, such as walking. Thirdly, the route of the path in this location makes sense in respect to the local topography. The northern end runs downhill from a local high point. The broader section lies at the base of the slope as the ground levels off. The gap to the east opens onto the higher ground between the track and the wetlands, while the southern end turns to avoid the wetlands, possibly following along the higher ground north of the river. Overall, the track appears to provide a prescribed route through wet and boggy ground in the vicinity of the Clonard site. This, combined with another Mesolithic date from a feature within the site, demonstrates an investment in the locality, implying that Mesolithic people returned to this area. Sorry. The most surprising aspect of the pathway is its potential longevity. The pathway has its origins in the Mesolithic period. There is no evidence that it was ever abandoned or decommissioned in prehistory. It is truncated by field boundary ditches that were laid out in the medieval and post-medieval periods. This land improvement and parcelling activity appears to mark the end of the trackway following the arrival of the Anglo-Normans. Interestingly, a field laneway is depicted along the projected line of the trackway to the southwest on Ordnance Survey mapping, which curves directly towards a Bronze Age roundhouse previously excavated in the same townland. This may well be a coincidence, however, it is possible that this is a late vestige of the pathway. To the north, Geophysical Survey also identified a linear feature along the projected line of the pathway, and may indicate it survives in that direction also. Few other Mesolithic sites have been excavated locally. To date, much of the Mesolithic activity in North Fingal largely consists of flint scatters and shell middens near the coast. A stone axe manufacturing site has been identified on Lambay Island, which also has its origins in the Mesolithic. The Mesolithic has long been linked with the development of the post-glacial forests in Ireland. In the past, this forestation has been seen as an inhibiting factor to settlement. However, Cillian Driscoll argues that Mesolithic communities were woodland dwellers, that they would have understood this environment intimately, and there is a growing corpus of Mesolithic sites that would not have been at the water's edge. Later prehistoric monuments were identified during the excavation, and their location appears to have been influenced by the route of the pathway. A barrow and a penannular enclosure were situated at strategic locations along the pathway, in positions that may relate to lines of sight from it. The construction of both of these monuments has been dated to the Bronze Age. However, late Mesolithic and early Neolithic dates were returned from features beside the enclosure, suggesting that the origins of these monument locations had been marked from a much earlier date. Based on the spatial relationship between the monuments and the pathway, it seems probable that the route remained in use during the Bronze Age. Furthermore, both monuments have Iron Age phases, which may suggest that the pathway remained in use until the end of the prehistoric period. The curving route of the pathway offered changing views of prehistoric features within the site and the wider landscape. If approaching from the northwest, the pathway runs downhill directly towards the Barrow. It then turns slightly at the base of the slope to run towards the penannular enclosure. The path then turns again to run to the south and would have passed around 28 metres west of the Barrow. If approaching in the opposite direction, the path is facing northeast, where a late Bronze Age settlement enclosure was uncovered to the north of the site. As the pathway turns to run upslope, it is running in the direction of the site uncovered at Flemingtown, which had features dating from the Neolithic to the early medieval period, including an early Neolithic house and a Middle Bronze Age hilltop enclosure. The pollen core indicates that by the early Neolithic there was little tree cover in the surrounding area. The lack of tree cover in the vicinity of the wetland marsh would have improved visibility of sites and monuments from the pathway over this open and low-lying area. Visibility and intervisibility seems to have been a concern for monument builders when they designed the prehistoric landscape, as discussed by numerous authors in both Irish and international contexts. While some have argued that ceremonial routeways evolved through landscapes of pre-existing monuments, at Clonard, by contrast, the locations of the monuments appears to have been carefully selected based on their visibility from the established Mesolithic trackway. The monuments along the pathway at Clonard are put on display for those passing by. It's interesting to note that the single entrance from the avenue to the east does not lead directly towards the monuments on the site. This may suggest that people walking down the avenue were encouraged to view but not physically access the monuments. This may mark the distinction between the public realm of the pathway and a claimed or private realm marked by the monuments. How could features such as the shallow gullies defining the edge of the pathway have existed for such an extended period of time? It's not known whether the pathway would have had any above-ground markers. The gullies were narrow and of no great depth. They would not have produced quantities of soil to create banks of any great scale. The pathway would have been defined at a minimum by a strip of cleared ground through the woods and forests. The maintenance of this cleared pathway appears to have been more important than the maintenance of the gullies themselves, which filled in over time. Indeed, as only Mesolithic charcoal survived within the gullies, this suggests that they filled in early in the lifetime of the pathway. As the landscape evolved and clearances were created for agriculture, the pathway may have been defined by vegetation along either side, preserving its line. Once the pathway had been established, there would be no reason to abandon it, providing it still served a purpose, such as accessing the meadow at the head of the valley, or circumnavigating and accessing the wetlands. The established pathway may also have influenced boundaries of later land ownership, constraining options for choosing new routes at a later time. As Tilly has pointed out, once established, a route or path becomes the obvious template for future movement, maintaining and prolonging a pathway beyond the use of its original constructors. There is usually a good reason for following it in a particular direction, linking places in a serial trajectory, and the more people who have a shared in the purpose of a path, the more important it becomes. While rare, other paths or trackways have been uncovered in Ireland, dating to the Mesolithic period. A pine trackway, excavated at Lollimore Bog in County Kildare, dates to around 6,200 to 5,900 BC. An early Mesolithic date was returned for a brushwood sample from Lough Gara, while a wooden structure or platform from Inch Island, also in Lough Gara, returned a late Mesolithic date. This has led Killian Driscoll to suggest that wooden architecture was widespread by this time. At Lollimore and Lough Gara, the trackways and structures may have been used to access valuable resources from the wetlands, and this was also the case at Clonard. The Mesolithic trackways at Lollimore and Clonard can be seen as a response to the demands of their particular environment. Their presence hints at a greater level of significance given to travel and communication during the Mesolithic period. The trackway at Lollimore, at 1.8 metres in width, is wider than many later prehistoric pathways. At over 4 metres in width, the pathway at Clonard is the widest currently identified in Ireland from this period, over double the size of the Lollimore example. It is of a similar scale to the Iron Age Road at Corlay and the larger primary towers at Evercloon. Admittedly, the greater scale may relate to the fact that less effort and energy was required for its creation. The clearing of a strip through the forest and digging of the gullies would have been easier on dry land, as opposed to cutting and laying of brushwood and timbers to form a trackway over wetland. However, the size of the Clonard trackway would have been large enough to handle animal and human traffic, and this may have influenced its survival into later prehistory. As well as overland routes, rivers would have acted as routeways, particularly in the earlier prehistoric period. The Braymore River, which runs through the Clonard site, is too small to have been used for navigation, and this is also likely to have been the case in the past. Low gradient rivers such as the Braymore River would naturally have been difficult terrain, with many thin channels threading through dense woodlands, and as such would not have been useful for overland travel along the riverbanks. Furthermore, the wetlands at the eastern end of Clonard would have been an additional impediment. This may explain the original need for the pathway, which would have allowed travellers to circumnavigate these wetlands on the way to or from the sea, or perhaps between the larger river systems to the north and south. The Clonard Trackway provides access to the wetlands, which contain valuable resources. It may also have provided access to other local natural resources, such as the river itself and the meadow at the head of the valley. The river systems of the Delvin and the Bracken to the north and south of the site were navigable, at least up to a point. These river systems provided access from the coast to the uplands, from the early prehistoric period. The River Delvin appears to have been used to access the uplands of Fornox to the west, by the Neolithic at the latest. A small passage tomb cemetery at the mouth of the river at Gormanstown possibly marks this important access. While no mound has been identified at the mouth of the Bracken to the south, a mound is present along the line of the river, and a cluster of mounds are present at the head of the river at Knockbrack. Interestingly, 2 undated mounds are present at the mouth of the Braymore River, possibly marking an access to the interior from this point. The location of a number of features on the site may have been influenced by the presence of the pathway. Dating to later in the Mesolithic, a small pit to the east was the second oldest feature identified during the excavation, and returned a date of around 4370 to 4250 BC. The purpose of the pit is unknown. However, the fact that this location was selected for later activity in the early Neolithic and Bronze Ages may indicate that it had significance for an extended period of time. Warren has suggested that some pathways through the dense woodlands were long established in the Mesolithic period, and that particular routes through the trees created certain views and vistas, in a subtle way structuring a community's experience of the local world. It is possible that some above-ground markers survived here that informed or encouraged subsequent generations to return to this spot for various purposes. In the early Neolithic period, another pit was created just over 10 meters east, which was radiocarbon dated to around 3780 to 3650 BC. The pit contained low quantities of unidentifiable burnt bone, along with sherds of undecorated bone-tempered Neolithic pottery, burnt flint, and fragments of baked clay. Rose Cleary suggested that the baked clay within the pit may have been gathered for pottery production and accidentally fired, or that it could have been used in the firing process. The burnt bone present within the pit may have been gathered for the same purpose. A second pit containing 2 sherds of Neolithic pottery was identified on the slightly higher ground to the west of the pathway, further evidence of the interaction of Neolithic peoples with this location. The first large monument to be created in the land between the pathway and the wetlands was a ring barrow, the earliest fill of which dated to around 2190 to 1940 BC. This places the original construction of the monument at the end of the Chalcolithic period and the start of the early Bronze Age. The central portion of the monument was excavated by Jill McLaughlin in 2016. The monument is defined by a substantial circular ring ditch, just over 7 meters in internal diameter, with no evidence of an entrance causeway. No features survived within the interior. There was evidence that the monument originally had an external bank and a central mound. The ditch was substantial and would have created over 46 cubic meters of soil for the creation of the mound and bank. A number of phases of silting, slumping, and subsequent redefinition were identified within the ditch. Large boulders were deposited in the ditch at the same time as a substantial backfilling event. The position and number of the boulders led to the suggestion that they may originally have stood on the encircling bank. A ring of boulders standing on a potentially substantial bank would have made the monument stand out in the landscape, despite its low-lying location. The boulders were water-rolled, possibly originating in the Braymore River to the south. 2 later post holes were cut into the largely backfilled ditch to the east and west. These may have been added to mark the location of or reinterpret the now largely levelled monument. A similar example has been excavated by James Ogan and Damien Finn at Ballybrona South in County Tipperary, where at least one post was driven into the fill of the ditch on one side, interpreted as a marking of the former monument. Following the removal of the post, the barrow was finally filled in with a radiocarbon date from the upper fill returning a date of 804 to 507 BC, in the transitional period from the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age. In all, the monument was in existence for a minimum of 1,140 years and possibly up to 1,640 years, which is an exceptional length of survival. Perhaps the most significant feature of the Barrow is its location. The Barrow was constructed at a point between the pathway, the stream, and the wetlands. It lies along a direct line of sight from the pathway. This seems to be a well-selected and significant location for a monument, which despite its low-lying position would have been highly visible in the landscape for those using the path. The setting of the ring ditch, low-lying near wetland, is not unusual, and Owen Grogan has suggested that the concentration of barrows and ceremonial enclosures along river floodplains, areas perhaps unsuitable for settlement, reflects the division of the landscape into domestic and ritual spheres. The proximity to water is likely to have been an important consideration in the locating of the barrow. Some of the fills within the ditch were water-laid silts, possibly relating to periods of higher water levels when the monument was inundated. In addition, the Braymore River, now forming the townland boundary to the south, may have been an early territorial boundary, and the placement of the barrow may have been to mark the edge of this territory. A tiny quantity of cremated bone was retrieved from the earliest fill of the ditch, while further small quantities were retrieved from the upper fills. These deposits did not represent complete burials. The largest concentration was retrieved from the portion of the barrow excavated by Jill McLaughlin and was radiocarbon dated to 934 to 807 BC. The deposit consisted of the partial remains of an adult, with the majority of identified fragments deriving from the skull. Skull fragments were also retrieved from the upper fills of the barrow to the north. There may have been a focus on the collection of bone from the head for burial within the barrow. Two of the deposits of cremated remains appear to have been disturbed from the bank. This suggests that the late Bronze Age cremation deposits ended up in the ditch either intentionally or accidentally during the partial destruction of the monument, a phase that included the deposition of the boulders that originally encircled the bank. Off-white, smooth, water-rolled pebbles were associated with two of the cremation deposits. It would appear that these were intentionally collected and deposited with the cremations, possibly as part of the burial rites. Small quantities of animal bone were found in all phases of the ditch. Most of the bones were from animal legs, which may reflect a conscious selection process. Were these bones selected specifically for deposition in a burial monument, or are they the remains of butchery and animal processing, accidentally incorporated into the fills? The context of the monument and the lack of adjacent settlement evidence here would imply the former. A fragment of horse femur was also retrieved from the fill of the barrow that has been dated stratigraphically to between 2140 and 805 BC, a broad Bronze Age date. An attempt to directly date the horse bone failed, as too little collagen survived. Horses are not present in the archaeological record in Ireland prior to the Late Bronze Age, and may have been introduced to the country at this time. Horsebone has been identified in later Bronze Age contexts from 9 sites in Ireland. So why here? One possible reason could be the nearby pathway. The pathway and its association with communication and movement may have influenced what was being deposited within the barrow. Perhaps the presence of animal leg and feet bones within the barrow was influenced by this. Waddell has outlined the ritual importance of the horse in later prehistory in the Celtic-speaking world, arguing for the survival of aspects of a prehistoric equine cult in the literary and archaeological record. Cattle were also venerated across Europe, with numerous Irish sagas and myths detailing their significance in society. Perhaps the animal bone at Clonard, given its fine location within a burial monument, is an aspect of this veneration. A penannular enclosure was also uncovered, located on the southern side of a low rise in the wetlands east of the pathway. Marshy ground was present to the north and east of the enclosure, with the stream now forming the townland boundary to the south. The earliest phase of the enclosure was dated to around 1500 to 1300 BC in the Middle Bronze Age. It truncated the late Mesolithic pit previously mentioned. The enclosure was oval in plan, measuring around 23 metres by 18.5 metres internally. An entrance in the form of an undug causeway was located to the east-southeast. The entrance termini of the enclosure were deeper and more substantial than the rest of the ditch. They were aligned at an angle, with the southern terminus distinctly curving inwards. The ditch originally held an upright fence or palisade. 5 post holes were recorded along the base of the ditch, along with a narrow slot in places. This is an unusual location for a fence line or palisade. John Bradley has made a comparison between British Bronze Age houses and nearby barrows, noting a similarity in the organisation of space. Irish Lake Bronze Age houses frequently have their entrances at some point between south and east, which is also noted in contemporary British examples. The consistency of this orientation, regardless of the prevailing wind conditions, should suggest a shared ideology of how houses should be oriented. Perhaps there was some attempt to replicate this layout at the Clonard enclosure, with the palisade representing the walls and the entrance placed to the southeast to replicate the location of typical house entrances. Approaches to the enclosure were also considered, with access to it restricted by the wetlands. The route from the pathway possibly ran between the barrow and the enclosure. The palisade may also have had a role in this, perhaps serving as a screening function, obscuring views of activities being carried out within the enclosure from certain areas, with visual access only gained upon entry to the enclosure. A discrete charcoal-rich upper fill of the ditch returned a radiocarbon date of around 400 to 210 BC. This indicates activity occurring at the enclosure in the Iron Age. A similar date range was returned for a charcoal production pit near the pathway. The similarity in date from both burnt deposits supports the argument that the Penallier enclosure and the trackway continued to be used into the Iron Age. Middle Bronze Age pottery was retrieved from the lower fills of the enclosure, in a concentration to the southeast. The sherds may all have come from a single vessel, which is likely to have been a storage vessel. Sherds of a crucible, richly tempered with finely crushed granitic stone and ground quartz on the internal surface, were found within the main concentration of ceramics. Crucibles of a similar size and shape were recorded at Knockadune Hill near Lough Gur and at Dunengasa on the Aran Islands. A grinding stone was also retrieved nearby and may have been used in a metalworking event. A small fragment of a clay mould for a pin shank or awl was also retrieved from the earliest fill of the enclosure, dating to the Middle Bronze Age, and represents one of the earliest fragments of a Bronze Age clay mould uncovered in Ireland to date. Bronze Age clay moulds are relatively rare in the Irish archaeological record, having been identified from 17 sites, with casting jets retrieved from a further 2. Previous examples of clay moulds have generally been dated to around 1000 to 900 BC, with only one site at Lough Iskra predating that timeframe. Although composite stone and clay moulds are recorded in the Middle Bronze Age, such as at Lough Gur, casting in clay moulds was previously thought to have been introduced at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, around 1200 BC. With the exception of Rathgall, bronze casting from the majority of other sites were short-term and small-scale, supporting a model where experienced smiths were brought in as required. This is also applicable at Clonard. It is conceivable that the finds from the enclosure relate to a single metalworking event, which may also have seen the breaking of a ceramic vessel, and that all the objects were originally deposited together. Only a small assemblage of finds were retrieved from the enclosure. Very small quantities of animal teeth were returned, and charcoal was rare in the basal deposits. There was little evidence to suggest that the enclosure functioned as a settlement. Its position, surrounded by wet and marshy ground, may not have been appealing as a habitation site. The enclosure is located amongst other prehistoric funerary or ritualized monuments at a strategic location in relation to the trackway. On this basis, the enclosure may have had a non-domestic function. Metalworking took place at the enclosure, with this activity likely to have been both highly ritualized and controlled during the Bronze Age. Metalworking areas are generally separate from domestic areas on Irish Bronze Age sites. The form of the enclosure at Clonard, with its internal bank and palisade fence running along the base of the ditch, does not conform with a model of Bronze Age ceremonial ditch enclosures. However, the location of the enclosure is consistent with examples explored in the North Munster project, which tended to avoid prominent locations. While their setting varied, examples were recorded from terraces overlooking wet or marshy ground and river edges. At Clonard, the Barrow and the penannular enclosure, which were in use at the same time for at least part of their lifespans, occupy the liminal space between the ancient pathway and the wetland. This liminal space may have been viewed as a place for the dead and for non-domestic activities. Exploitation of the wetlands. At the edge of the wetlands near the penannular enclosure, a Middle Bronze Age burnt spread was uncovered, which was radiocarbon dated to around 1660 to 1500 BC. This spread was thin and poorly surviving and was not associated with a trough. A late Bronze Age Fullafia was also uncovered nearby, which was radiocarbon dated to around 1230 to 1040 BC. The trough was sub-rectangular in plan with 5 staples identified around the edges, indicating it had originally been lined. A number of additional burnt mines and Fullactafia have been identified in the immediate vicinity, indicating that the wetlands here were a well-used resource. 2 charcoal production pits were identified on either side of the pathway to the west. One was radiocarbon dated to 389 to 205 BC, indicating use in the early Iron Age. This is contemporary with the charcoal deposit at the top of the penannular enclosure ditch. At Clonard, the charcoal production pits, Fullactafia and burnt mines were located in the ritualized landscape of the kin group that used them. This ritualized landscape would have extended to more than just the burial monuments themselves, and would have included all aspects of life that required social control. The production of and exploitation of resources would have required social controls determining who used them, who benefited from them, when they were used, and for how long. Many of the features on the site date to the Bronze Age, marking an intensification of activity here. This is also reflected in the surrounding area. An early Bronze Age inverted basket structure, possibly an animal trap, was uncovered to the west, while a large watering hole and Fullactafia were uncovered to the south. The Middle Bronze Age saw an increase in activity, with the hilltop enclosure uncovered in Flemingtown to the north by Ruth Elliott, dating to this period. This is likely to have been a key component of the Bronze Age landscape in the vicinity of Clonard, and would have overlooked the valley of the Braemore River and all features within it. A contemporary Bronze Age roundhouse was uncovered to the west within the meadow at the head of the Braemore Valley. The pathway may have connected these locations to the penannular enclosure on the site. It is likely that those dwelling at the house and the hilltop enclosure were at least aware of the penannular enclosure and may have been involved either in its creation or in activities carried out there. Moving into the late Bronze Age, a further 3 houses are known from the southern side of the valley, all dating to between 1020 and 830 BC. These are contemporary with the cremation burial within the Barrow at Clonard and the ring ditch at Flemingtown. Added to this is the oval settlement enclosure to the north of the site. The intervisibility of this site with the pathway has been previously discussed, and it is possible that this enclosure represents another important feature of the late Bronze Age landscape of Clonard. This gives us 3 houses, 2 burial monuments, a hilltop enclosure, a probable settlement enclosure, and the penannular enclosure, all within 1.5 kilometres of the site that date to roughly the same period. The houses uncovered in the vicinity of Clonard account for over half the Bronze Age houses identified in Dublin to date. These features and monuments represent components of the local landscape of the kin group or kin groups that lived here at the time. Tilley has stated that paths establish and maintain social linkages and relations between individuals, groups, and political units. They are essential structures of the human landscape, weaving together disparate elements of daily lives, bridging distances and obstacles to connect people to each other. The creation and maintenance of the pathway must have been driven by a need to connect areas of bountiful resources, settlements, or places of significance. Graham Warren has argued that learning these traditional paths, their names, and the names of features of the landscape visible from their routes was a vital part of socialization. The continued existence of the pathway from the Mesolithic to the later prehistoric period indicates that the significance of this evolving ritual landscape surrounding it, as well as the original driving factors that in establishing the routeway, remained important. These later generations continued to use the path, leaving markers indicating territorial possession, ceremonial zones, or places of the dead. Thank you for your time.